Welcome everyone to the Scholarly Snippets Workshop, What to Expect from the IRB. I'm Kelli Hines from Western University of Health Sciences, and I am currently a non-scientific member of Western U's Institutional Review Board. I've been doing this for about 5 years, so that's my background, and I'm hoping that today we're going to be able to help demystify the Institutional Review Board a little bit, explain what it is, why it's important, and what they're looking for, because it can feel very opaque from the outside. Just kind of explain what they're looking for and how you can give it to them. So how you can avoid some common mistakes that would delay the approval of your research proposals. So the most important thing to understand about the Institutional Review Board is that the participant protection is the #1 most important thing. It doesn't matter how good your science is, how many people it could benefit, how interesting or cool it could be. If you are not protecting the participants who are involved in the study, it doesn't matter, you can't do it. So the Institutional Review Board is there to provide oversight to protect the human subjects that are involved in any kind of scientific or behavioral science or medical research that involves humans. And sadly, the reason that this is necessary is a long history of research misconduct, really shady, awful, horrific things that were done in the name of science. So it is about protecting people rather than just advancing the needs of science. So obviously the most horrific thing was the Nazi experiments in the concentration camps, which led to the Nuremberg trials for war crimes, which led to a code that basically said, okay, if you're doing any kind of research, you need to have voluntary and informed consent from the participants. There needs to be some kind of benefit to the research that outweighs the risks to the participants, and that the people should have the right to withdraw. And obviously none of those were the case at the time, but these were proposals basically saying, this is what we want to aspire to. We shouldn't have done this. We shouldn't have allowed this to happen. So in the future, we are not going to. And then the Declaration of Helsinki basically added those concepts. This was from the World Medical Association. They also added the concepts that people should be getting the best available treatment, and that essentially, to quote Captain Kirk, the needs of the one outweigh the needs of the many. So it doesn't matter how many benefits that there could be if the participants weren't being protected. However, despite all of this, there was still, surprisingly, research misconduct did not stop. And even here in the United States, there were a lot of really problematic, difficult studies, things like the Tuskegee syphilis study, Willowbrook, the Milgram obedience studies, the San Antonio contraception studies, where participants weren't informed that it was a placebo-blind trial, so they thought they were getting contraception when, in fact, they might not have been. The tea room trade study, just a lot of studies where people weren't informed about what was going to happen to them. They may have been coerced or deceived, and they didn't really know what they were getting into, or things weren't really explained, or they were not given treatments that they should have been given. And so essentially, out of all of that, the National Research Act was created, and it basically said any kind of research that involves human subjects has to be overseen by an institutional review board to review the ethics. And so the Institutional Review Board is composed of scientific experts, as well as it has to have non-scientific members and community members to make sure that the interests of the community and people outside of the scientific community are heard and being represented, because sometimes scientists can get a little excited about their research, understandably, but they may not think about them, or they may not be explaining things, or they may not be aware of or properly weighing the concerns of people outside of their community. And so that's why it has to have those members. Sometimes the community member and the non-scientific member are the same person. Sometimes they're separate, but either way, those concerns have to be represented. And the principles that they're used to determine whether something can proceed. These are kind of the ethical principles from the Belmont Report, which was after the IRB was established. There were these guidelines that were set. One, respect for persons, which means that people have autonomy, they have the right to choose, and that people who might not be able to choose for whatever reason, because they might be coerced, or they might have mental disabilities, or perhaps they're children, if they have sort of diminished autonomy or right to choose, that they are given additional protections. The second principle is beneficence, which is basically that maximize the benefits, minimize the harm, treat people well, basic human decency, essentially. And then the third principle is justice, which is that the risks and benefits of the research should be equally distributed among everyone. And this was to stop a sort of common practice of the poor bearing the risks of the research and being the ones that research was mostly conducted on, where the wealthy were the ones who were ultimately the ones who received the benefit of that research. So everyone should have a chance to participate, and everyone should have the right to benefit. So when you're submitting your proposal, it can go one of two ways. So you can do submission, and some IRBs will also have a form for request for determination. So if you're not sure if it needs IRB review or kind of what level it might go in at, you can fill out a shorter form that's a request for determination, and they can kind of let you know what's likely to happen to it, and whether you need to fill out a full proposal or not. So one, they could decide that it's not research, it doesn't require IRB oversight, or it falls into one of another three categories: exempt, expedited, or full board. And if it is exempt or expedited, these are kind of lower risk studies, things like survey research, educational research, market research, exercise studies, things with low risk to the participants. And they're still reviewed, but they're typically just reviewed by one person, and then it's kind of moved along because there's lower risk. It is still reviewed, but it is not as thoroughly discussed. If it is higher risk or a more complex study, something testing drugs, medical devices, or if it involves vulnerable people, then it will typically go to the full board. And so those will take longer because you have to wait for the full board to meet. And there will typically be more discussion, and you might get more feedback as a result. So there will typically be 2 reviewers assigned, but everyone has a chance to review and discuss. So I could basically have left it at what to expect from the IRB: paperwork and revisions. But so it exists kind of at the intersection of institutional bureaucracy and government bureaucracy. So there is paperwork. You do have to fill it out very thoroughly, and pretty much never will you get "this is perfect, no comments, approved." Don't expect just kind of a rubber stamp, because of these ethical issues, and because it's really important. You will almost always get some kind of feedback. So just make sure that you build in time for revisions. However, I am going to make sure that I give you some idea of kind of what the IRB is looking for and kind of a structure for looking at it, so that you can minimize the revisions that you have to make, so that you can kind of get it as close to right as possible the first time, so that the revisions you ask to make are going to be pretty quick and painless. So the criteria for IRB approval: 1, the risk to the participants are minimized. So whatever risks there are, they should be minimal. There shouldn't be any more risks than are absolutely necessary. And 2, that the risks are reasonable relative to the benefits. So if a study has a really high potential benefit, there might be a higher risk that's acceptable. We saw this with COVID. where there was a pandemic and there was a really strong interest in getting that under control. So higher risks were considered acceptable because of the strong benefits. That said, you still had to minimize the risk and inform people about the potential risks. So the risks have to be relative to the benefits. Something that might be an acceptable risk for a high risk study, with large benefits, might not be considered an acceptable risk if the benefits are lower. Make sure that you're choosing the participants equitably, that everyone who has a chance to participate, and that you're not just kind of doing a convenience sample. That you're making sure that you are seeking informed consent, that you're letting the participants know what they are getting into, that you're documenting that informed consent, and that if you need a waiver, that's the only possible way, that you can't do it without a waiver. In most cases, you are still going to have an informed consent, and you're going to need to make sure that you document that. You're also going to need to manage the data and monitor the participants for safety. So you need to make sure that if anything bad happens, if there are any kind of adverse events, that you are monitoring those and reporting those, and that if anything goes wrong, the participants know who they need to contact and what they need to do in case anything does go wrong. And that you're taking steps to protect the participants' privacy and confidentiality. There's always a risk of loss of data, but the more high risk the data is, the more that you need to work to protect it. And then finally, if there are any vulnerable participants, whether that's children, prisoners, homeless people, pregnant people, if there's anyone that has any kind of higher risk or vulnerability, that you have safeguards in place to protect them as well. So some common mistakes that can delay your application is, one, if it's incomplete or not detailed enough. You didn't fill everything out. You left things blank or just answered things very briefly. For the most part, you shouldn't just be saying NA or C, other section I filled out. If it's not applicable, you need to explain why it's not applicable. You need to be answering things in complete sentences, usually at least a couple of sentences, sometimes full paragraphs or like a full page, depending on what the question is asking. Make sure that you don't leave anything blank. If it needs to be signed, make sure it's signed, etc. Sometimes the information is inconsistent across the documents. So it might say something on the recruitment flyer that's different from what's in the informed consent, or it lists a risk in the protocol that's not listed on the informed consent. So I know it can be common for different people who are involved to be working on different parts of the application, but you really want to check and make sure that the information is consistent across the documents. Sometimes the procedures that are unclear, they're inconsistent, they're missing key steps, it's not really clear what's going on. The IRB cannot read your mind. This is really best for everybody. But what that means is we only have what you wrote to go off of. So if you didn't explain what steps that you're taking, we don't know, and we're going to kick that back to you for clarification. This is probably one of the #1 problems, is that the informed consent form is too technical, it's too vague, it's missing key information about risks. Typically, these are written at a really high scientific level and filled with a lot of jargon, and that's not really helpful because a lot of people who are participating in these studies don't have a scientific background. So you need to make sure that you're doing it in lay language and you're really explaining what's going on. If the data management plan is too vague, sometimes you won't explain who has access to the data, or what format it's in, who can view it, when it will be migrated, when it will be deleted, if it's going to be shared. Basically, if you just kind of have one sentence, that's probably not enough detail. I'll list a few steps and things to think about when you are thinking about data management. If the study designs instruments are inappropriate for the question, so if you're doing a survey data because that's easier, but really there's a way to get more objective, measurable data, then that might get kicked back and say, hey, is this really the best study design for answering this question? If you're not explaining the recruitment procedures, where you're going to be getting the participants, how you're going to be recruiting the participants, or if what you describe is not likely to get you the number of participants that you're looking for. If you overstate the potential benefits, so if you say this will reduce the incidence of the disease or this will offer an affordable alternative, you don't know, you haven't done the research, you can't overstate the benefits. You can say, we hope that this will, or this may, or this probably will, but don't overstate the potential benefits. And by the same token, don't understate the risks. And finally, if it's just not clear what kind of the big picture of the study is, why it matters, what you're hoping to accomplish, or you're not backing it up with prior research, you're not showing, previous animal studies or safety studies, or whatever that's been done, if you're just not making it clear where your research fits into the bigger picture. So I'm going to kind of break down some questions that you can ask yourself as you're planning out your protocol so that you're kind of answering all of the questions in a meaningful way. So first, for the study design, what is the larger problem or research issue? Why does it matter? What's the context? Why is it important that this research be done? This gets at the potential benefits of the study. What specific question is your research trying to answer? What is the gap in the literature that you're hoping to fill? How are you gathering information? Is it qualitative, survey, focus groups, narrative analysis? Are you getting blood draws, lab data? What type of information are you gathering, and how are you gathering this information? And what is the study design, and is it appropriate for answering the type of question that you're trying to answer? If you're doing a drug study, you probably want a randomized controlled trial, or a prospective cohort study. But just ask yourself, is it appropriate for answering the question? And then finally, are your procedures clear? If anything happened to you, would one of your other participants or one of the other investigators be able to pick it up? If we had to explain to somebody else what the research involved, would we be able to explain it based on what you've written? Now looking at the participants, how are you recruiting them? Are there people who are coming into your clinic, people who are taking your course? Are you reaching out to community stakeholders, social media, email? How are you recruiting it? Is it appropriate? Do the participants represent the population of interest? Are they the type of people who are actually going to help you answer the question that you're asking, or is it just kind of whoever is convenient? Who are you including and excluding, and why? So you're going to be listing out your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So you may be including adults with a particular condition, excluding people with a particular comorbidity for safety reasons, or just for the sake of simplicity. So you just need to explain who you're including, who you're excluding, and why. And basically, if there's any reason that you would turn down a person who wanted to participate, you need to make that clear, because otherwise, if they're eligible, you should take them. So you just need to kind of justify why you're choosing who is and isn't eligible to participate. Is there any potential for coercion? For example, if you're doing an educational study and it's a course that you control the grade for, how are you mitigating that? You might make the data anonymous. You might have them do it after grades have already been submitted. You may remove yourself. You might have somebody else administer the test, whatever it is. What steps are you taking to make sure that people aren't just coerced into you participating? And are there any participants at special risk? And if so, what are you doing to make sure that they are kept safe? And looking at benefits and risks, what are the potential benefits of the study? You should be able to articulate what you're hoping to get out of it. And what are the potential risks to the participants? Did you clearly disclose all of the different risks and discomforts? Whether that's just bruising from blood draws, loss of data, any risk and discomfort, however minor, just disclose it. Is there deception? For the most part, this only happens in psychological research. And you need to just say, do I need this? And is this the only way to get the data I need? And basically minimize the amount of deception that you're doing. So maybe you only hide the reason for the research, but not what the actual procedures of the research are. And then what steps are you taking to mitigate any risks? You should obviously just be able to explain that. So for data collection and analysis, just kind of look at what kind of data are you collecting? Is it lab data, numerical data, survey data, kind of ordinal data, narrative data? Is any of the data highly personal or high risk? So are you dealing with like HIPAA or FERPA data? Are you dealing with, for example, things that people might find embarrassing or that expose them to risk, like sexual history or citizenship status, anything like that? If you have anything that's higher risk, you have to take stronger steps to protect it. How are you going to be collecting the data? How is it going to be labeled? If you're de-identifying the data, how are you doing that? Is there any way to connect the participant ID back to the original participant? Where are you storing it? How long are you storing it for? Are you going to migrate it later? Are you going to destroy it after a certain point? If so, how? And sometimes if you are funded by federal grants, you might need to share the data for future research. There's a big trend to that. If so, where are you going to deposit the data? How are you going to share it, and so forth? Who has access to the data either now or in the future? Just make sure that you list out everyone who has access to the data, and that's clear. And if people are going to have access to the data in the future, how is that de-identified? How long is the data being kept? Is it being shared with anybody else, etc.? What safety measures are in place to prevent the misuse of the data? This can be anything from passwords, VPN, de-identifying, what have you. And then how are you planning to analyze the data? Are there any particular lab tests or statistical tests that you're planning to run? And then finally, just some kind of administrative things. Just make sure that you're listing everyone that's involved in the study. Make sure that they've all completed the necessary training. If you're involved with another IRB, they might have different things that are required. You'll usually want to set aside a few hours to do this if you haven't already done it. It's usually good for a few years, but you'll need to make sure that everyone who's involved, including the students, have had the time to complete any necessary training or certifications that they need. If there are any sources of grant funding or other sources of funding, make sure that you disclose that. And if there are any potential conflicts of interest, anything that could make people think that you have some kind of other interest in the study or the result of the study. Have you completely answered all of the questions, and is the information consistent across the different documents? So here are just sort of my final takeaway tips to make sure that you get the best experience out of this. Number one, make sure that you give yourself plenty of time. Give yourself more time than you think that you need. Give yourself at least a month for even just basic exempt studies. Give yourself a couple of months if you suspect it might be a full board review. It might not take that long, or it might take longer, but whatever amount of time you think you need, double it, triple it, just make sure that you give yourself time, and make sure that you plan in times for revisions as well. So just make sure that you're not putting it off to the last minute, because that's just stressful for everyone. This isn't just kind of a rubber stamp, yes, approved thing. they're going to have questions, they're going to have comments. Make sure that you're building that time in. And ask questions early. Submit a request for determination. If you're not sure of something, if you're not sure of the procedure for submitting, if you're not sure what kinds of things you need to ask, if you're just unclear what kind of information is necessary, ask your IRB. They're there to help you. They're happy to help you. And the earlier that you ask questions, the sooner they can kind of clarify things for you. And every IRB is going to be a little bit different. Every institution kind of has its own like special rules and things that they might be looking for beyond just kind of what a typical IRB does. If you're working with another institution particularly, ask if there's any kind of memorandum of understanding, or if you need to report to both IRBs, or if like once it's approved by one IRB, it's good for the other one and they just kind of need to know about it. Every IRB is going to kind of have their own rules and guidelines for it. So particularly if you're working with other institutions that have their own IRB, ask ahead of time. Just make sure that you're going to have, just make sure you have that in place. Make sure that you answer the questions completely. Make sure that you're filling things out in detail. Just remember, we can't read your mind. So what you write is the only thing that we have to go off of. So just make sure that you've not left any blanks. And if you have to spend the most time on one particular thing, I would focus on the informed consent. Number one, that's what a lot of the reviewers are going to look at first. And number two, this is also one of the first things that the participants are going to see besides perhaps the recruitment flyer. And if you can explain things in lay language on an informed consent, it's pretty easy to go back through and add some more complex citations and jargon and details in the protocol, versus taking all of that complex scientific information and trying to work it into the informed consent. It's much easier to start with the informed consent and then go and start with kind of the end participant in mind and then go back, versus the other way. And then finally, get feedback before submitting. Give your informed consent to somebody who doesn't do scientific research. Have them ask questions. I guarantee they'll let you know if something is not clear just based on kind of like the questions that they ask. You'll know where you've been unclear. So it can just be helpful to have somebody look at it, have your team look at it, just to and then just kind of check them against these questions. So just show it to somebody and get feedback before submitting. So now I'm going to go ahead and open it up to any questions. So I saw a question. Is providing an incentive to participate in the study considered coercion? That depends. Typically, it's not. Typically, if you're offering some kind of incentive to participate, you want to make sure that it's not enough to push somebody who wouldn't otherwise participate in the study into doing it. But it can be enough to just kind of be like, if people are on the fence, they're kind of like, I could or I couldn't, sure, I will. Basically, it's just kind of, the incentive should be just kind of like to offset the time and inconvenience of doing the study. Where you would want to be careful is if you're dealing with any kind of vulnerable populations, for example, people who are really poor or homeless, and you're offering some kind of cash incentive, then that could potentially be coercive. So it kind of depends on the context. So it's just kind of like, are there any particular vulnerabilities that you're keeping in mind? But it's not inherently coercive, but it could be in certain contexts. So I hope that answers the question. What other questions do we have? yes, it's important to consider different institutional guidelines. So everyone's going to have their own unique institutional specific things. And every IRB kind of has their own timeline for things. So make sure that you talk to your own IRB as well. Any other questions from anyone? Yes, so if there are multiple institutions, you want to make sure that you ask your IRB ahead of time, because sometimes certain institutions will have a kind of agreement where if it's approved by one, it is automatically approved by another. Sometimes they may have, sometimes both IRBs may need to approve it and be involved in it. So if you have multiple institutions, just make sure that you ask early about that and make sure that you give yourself extra time. So would a university IRB help an entity that does not have an IRB, like a health clinic, public department, or hospital? Yes, some they can. Some IRBs do, and that is one service that the IRB have. So you would you could reach out to another IRB to see if they don't have it, or you could reach out to other hospital IRBs. So let's see, describing exempt review and expedited review. So I'm typically not the one that reviews it, but examples of exempt are things like educational research, quality improvement studies, survey research, anything that's fairly minimal risk. And then expedited is slightly higher risk, but not more than higher risk. So it's things like market studies and you know, things like exercise studies, or things that involve kind of only minimal things like finger prick blood draws, or fairly minor things like that. However, you can also ask your own institution, and I could also just consult the little institutional review board member handbook. So people ask kind of how I got involved and the time commitment. So I got asked to participate in the IRB. I had kind of formed relationships with the Office of Research and Biotechnology, doing things like a research mixer. So we'd hosted events together, and I'd sort of slowly built up a reputation over time as somebody who would help people with research and with publication questions. And eventually they asked if I would be willing to serve as a non-scientific member. I think after a previous member left, there was a vacancy. And so they asked, and I agreed to serve. As far as time commitment, we meet about once a month for an hour and a half, typically. So that's the full board meeting. And if I have a review that obviously takes longer, it can take, you know, some of them can take a fair amount of time. And now we have the exempt and expedited reviews used to be handled by one person, but that person has since retired. So now we do the exempt and expedited reviews on kind of a rolling basis. So you're essentially on call for a 2-week period, and then you would review any protocols that come in during your particular block of time. So yeah, great questions. Other questions? Yeah, so Charles, did I answer your question enough about exempt and expedited review, or do you want me to kind of go into a little bit more detail? Because I can consult that really quickly if you are interested. Yes, okay. So yeah, so basically, but just as a general rule, low risk means that there's less review, and that the higher risk, the higher the level of review that goes into it. So thank you. I hope that this was helpful for everyone. So go ahead and make sure, please, to fill out the survey if people are interested in further workshops on this or related topics. And make sure you save the date for April 13th for up-to-date and Dynamed overview, both really great. Yes, thank you. And Dana, did I answer your question enough? Because I know that some do offer it. So, you know, you just need to reach out. But it is going to kind of vary in terms of what level of time they have available and what they're willing to commit. So you might reach out a couple of different places. Yeah, okay, you're welcome, everyone. And so these are references for further reading, and I'll probably also, when this goes up on YouTube, I'll also include some additional links just to make sure that, to give some kind of background on some of the previous shady studies that were done that led to the creation of this in the first place. So thanks so much, everyone. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day.